Jonathan, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before you get started?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. So my name is Jonathan Hill, and I am Senior Lecturer in Philosophy of Religion at the University of Exeter here in the southwest of the UK. And I'm just recovering from a truly horrendous cold. So if my voice gives out halfway through, then it's not divine judgment, at least hopefully not.
So the topic today was eternal boredom in heaven. What is your position on that?
Well, so just to give some background to myself, I say I'm a lecturer in philosophy of religion, but my kind of area of speciality really is what's sometimes called analytic theology, which is kind of looking. So traditionally, philosophy of religion focuses on like big things like is there a God and is there life after death and stuff like that, but in recent years, there's been a trend towards sort of putting those big questions on one side a bit and focusing on particular doctrines. So, religious people don't just believe in gods, they believe in the Trinity, or something like that. And so there's this tendency today in philosophy of religion to look at particular doctrines and sort of analyze those philosophically. So that's what I've done to a certain extent. I spent some years looking at the doctrine of incarnation before looking at the doctrine of heaven. So that's kind of my research interest at the moment. So yeah, one of the questions you can ask about any religious doctrine, I guess, is not simply whether it's true, but whether it's coherent, right? Whether it makes sense, whether it could be true, or whether it describes something that's impossible. And there's been a fair bit of discussion over the past few decades on the doctrine of heaven in particular, because some people think that it's impossible, it's incoherent. There couldn't be a perfectly happy state that lasts literally forever. For various reasons, the most well-known of which is the boredom problem, the idea that even if it were fantastic, you'd still get bored. No matter how wonderful heaven would be, imagine the most wonderful state you could be in. Well, after 100 years or so, it might start to get a little bit samey. And maybe after a few million years, you'd be thinking you could really do with a change. And after a few billion years, you'd be so bored that you'd prefer not to exist at all. So if that's true, if that is true, that we would inevitably become bored, even given paradise, then the doctrine of heaven, the idea that you go after your death to somewhere that is fabulous and will be so forever, is an incoherent doctrine. It can't be true at all. So I don't agree with that argument. I don't think that it is an incoherent idea. I don't think that the reasons that people have given for thinking that you would necessarily become bored are very good reasons. So I'm inclined to think that the doctrine of heaven is at least coherent. Whether it's true or not, of course, is another matter. But, I think it at least clears that fairly low bar of being something that could be true.
So why is that? Why do you think we would not necessarily be eternally bored in heaven? How do you solve that problem?
Well, I'd turn the question around a bit and I'd say, why would we necessarily become horribly bored?
Well, I think the idea would be something along the lines of, given our human nature, stories that entertain us usually require ups and downs. And if we have infinite amount of time, we'd go through potentially all the stories. Assuming we have perfect memory, we would then know all of the potential stories, and so it would get bored. So like we don't typically watch the same movie over and over again. We usually get bored with it and watch something else, and so we need some kind of novel entertainment factor. And once we get to some point in eternity, we're gonna essentially know all of the things to know, all of the stories potentially, or a large enough portion of them to make them no longer entertaining. And the fact that in a perfect world with no suffering, death, pain, whatever, we would probably not enjoy stories very much, because most of the stories we do enjoy requires ups and downs and conflicts and death and that kind of thing, lots of sin and
Hmm.
pain. And so without that, it seems like many stories would be boring. Like the idea that we could be in a perfect world just eternally and no conflict seems like a rather boring idea, as opposed to like video games where it's conflict all the time.
Hmm. So yeah, so that's quite a good way of putting it. So I'd have several things to say in response to that. So the first is that there's a funny sort of tension there, because what you've just said, that we the idea that we need conflict and ups and downs and things like that to have a meaningful existence is the kind of thing that religious people often say when you raise the problem of evil, right? That's a common response to the problem of evil. Why are there bad things in the world we see around us? Well, says one possible answer, we need those in order for the world to have meaning. You know, if we lived in a sort of perfect world where nothing ever went wrong, then we would never develop morally as people, and you know, nothing would have any meaning. So it's kind of weird, you know. There's this kind of tension, because on the one hand, a religious person might want to say that, but on the other hand, they don't want to say it in relation to heaven, if you see what I mean, right? We're told that you need conflict or negativity or something like that for life on earth to be meaningful, and yet we don't need it in heaven, which is kind of weird, you know. And it goes the other way as well. You know, if you're arguing as an atheist that we need negativity for life to have meaning, then that kind of plays into the hands of religious people to a certain degree. So there's whichever side of that debate you're on, there's a kind of tension, I think. I mean, personally, I don't think we need negativity and pain and you know, conflict in that sense. I mean, like, you raise video games. It's true that a video game to be interesting has to have challenge, but it doesn't have to be conflict or anything horrible and negative. You know, there's a challenge to overcome, but that's not the same thing as pain or suffering or, you know, literally conflict. You know, if you play Tetris, you're not fighting against something, you know, except blocks. It's very abstract. More fundamentally, though, I think that if it is true that we have a tendency to get bored of stuff that's always the same or that's always good or something, then that's a kind of that's a contingent psychological fact about the way that we just are in this world. If it is true that we tend to get bored by stuff, then I don't see why that has to be a necessary fact about, you know, like any psychological state we're in will necessarily go that way. I'd have thought that if there is a God who is capable of creating a heaven and putting us in it, then presumably God would be capable of changing us psychologically so that we don't get bored of stuff. I think, so put it like this, a lot of people, well, a number of people have kind of argued along the way you just have, by saying that becoming bored is a kind of psychologically necessary feature of human psychology, or not just human psychology, but any kind of created thing. Necessarily, we become bored unless there is something that sort of stops us from becoming bored. Now, I don't think that's true. You know, I just don't. Maybe I'm easily entertained, but you know, I could quite happily do nothing for like an indefinite amount of time, and I don't think I would get bored. I think I would appreciate not having to do stuff. You know, maybe this says more about my psychology than it does about human nature in general, but still, that's how I feel. But maybe I'm wrong. Okay, maybe we would always get bored. But even so, that's just a feature of, it's a contingent feature of human psychology. I don't see why it has to be a necessary feature of how we would have to be. So put it like this, there's a fashionable view in theology at the moment to the effect that heaven, if it exists, is a place of constant striving and changing. And this is actually a common answer to the boredom problem. The idea that in heaven we're always learning new things and we're always developing in new ways, and we're morally improving ourselves, and we're learning stuff all the time, and so on. And to my mind, that sounds exhausting, right? I do not like the sound of a heaven like that. But if I were to say that to someone who believes in such a heaven, they would say, well, that's because you are thinking in earthly terms, right? God could easily make it so that you don't get exhausted by that sort of thing. And, surely that is true. Well, if God could make it so we don't get exhausted by a constant striving sort of heaven, then I didn't see why God couldn't make it so that we don't get bored by always the same kind of heaven, if you see what I mean. So I don't think that the boredom objection is really a fatal one to heaven. I don't think that we are necessarily constituted so that we become bored by stuff. And even if we are constituted in that way at the moment, then it's just a contingent fact about us. And any God that's capable of creating a heaven ought to be able to sort things out so that we don't get bored by it, I would say.
So a few thoughts came to mind when you were going through that. The first would be is that the eternal drug machine, or the eternal happiness machine thought experiment in philosophy, like we can get put into a machine where you're just given a constant stream of heroin, so you're just perfectly happy all the time. It sounds a lot.
Machine.
Yeah, experience machine. It sounds very much like if God had the capability of doing that to us, of course, he wouldn't necessarily be bored in any given instant because we would just be high all the time. And so it sounds very much like that. But given our current questions, most people would not go into the experience machine. We'd prefer not to do that. And so it seems like it would be counterintuitive to human nature to be changed in such a way that you are able to just prefer boredom eternally. Most people would probably not want that. Even if they had the option, they would not choose that. And the second would be video games do entail genuine suffering quite often, especially if you play very difficult video games. Dark Souls, Ninja Gaiden, even Tetris at the highest levels are like screaming, throwing your controller at the wall kind of levels of suffering because you're just so into it and it's challenging. And that's one of the benefits of it. That's why people play. They want the challenge. They want the difficulty. They want to overcome the significantly harder aspects of the game, and it's fun for them. And so removing that would seem to be removing a significant portion of joy from a lot of people's lives, because they like the high levels of conflict, high levels of competition, the failure aspects. And so it seems like you would be removing a very significant aspect to what joy is, what happiness is, and that would just be off limits to us. It'd be outside of heaven. Heaven is not allowed. You're not allowed to experience that kind of happiness, which would seem to be a problem. So, because my view of what a perfect world, what a heaven should be like, would be a world where you can never force people to do what they don't consent to, but they can design their own world essentially. So if I wanted to play Ninja Gaiden and Dark Souls and have really, really challenging, painful experiences that essentially mirrored earthly experiences, so I could experience all the pain and suffering of earth and get stabbed with a sword and experience that, I would have the freedom to do so. And same with experiencing sin or things, being harmed, fighting, conflicts, pain, suffering, all those things should be options that I should be able to choose from in designing my video game. And if I don't have those options, it seems like the world isn't quite good. It seems like you've cut off a large options of possible goods that you could experience. Now, I would agree with what you said initially, that this seems to run into conflict with the problem of evil responses. But I think as long as it's consensual, all suffering is fine. It's moral as long as it's consensual. And so in this case, people choosing to experience suffering, they can gain all of the benefits of the potential goodnesses of the world, without any of the immoral actions where those things are non-consensual. So in my view, it's totally fine to have evil and suffering as long as it's optional, in which case you get all of the possible benefits of these things and all of the possible experiences you might want to have, plus whatever things God has in store for you in heaven that we just don't understand yet. So you have all of those things plus all of these other things, whereas in the heaven you've described, it seems like all of these worldly goods are off limits, which seems to be a problem for heaven, or at least your version of heaven. It's not as perfect as this model that I'm describing,
Hmm.
which would then seem to imply that it does have a more higher proclivity to boredom than the world I'm describing, which has more opportunities for people, as well as the fact that it does sound a lot like the experience machine, where God's just giving you heroin, perpetual heroin addiction, because you're no longer you. You're no longer the fundamental nature of what humans desire or want out of the world. And so changing them that fundamentally seems to make them no longer human and defeat the entire point of the whole human experience.
Well, so on the experience machine, I mean, supposedly the reason, I mean, it's always said that most people would not choose the experience machine. I don't know if there's actually been, scientific surveys done to carry this out. But supposedly people wouldn't want to be in the experience machine, not because it would change who you are, but because the experiences it gives you aren't real, right? So you're like a brain in a vat, experiencing some kind of wonderful, happy world, but it's not real. And so people wouldn't want to be in it because it wouldn't be real. And the thought experiment is supposed to show that we value reality more than we value happiness or pleasure or whatever. I mean, as you may gather, I'm not convinced by that. I mean, personally, I'd much rather be in the experience machine. I wouldn't care that it's not real at all. But maybe I'm in a minority there. I don't know. I think so. The idea that one of the reasons why I find it interesting to talk about heaven, I find it interesting. I hope other people do as well. Is that it is kind of like a thought experiment, So I'm a philosopher by background more than a theologian. So I come to philosophy of religion and analytic theology as a philosopher, and for me, things like religious doctrines like this are interesting because they act almost as giant thought experiments, So when we ask what would heaven be like, unless we're actually genuinely asking that as a sort of religious question, we're sort of asking what we value, So imagine the most perfect state you could imagine that lasts forever. What would that state be like? Whether or not such a state actually exists, that's an interesting question because it tells us something about what we value. So what you've just said, indicates that you value conflict or at least difficulty, and I don't know if suffering is the right word, because if it were genuinely suffering, then it would be, well, I don't know. I would tend to define suffering as something that you sort of by definition don't want. So if it's something that you do want, then it's not really suffering exactly. It's I don't know what one would call it.
Well, I would say I value choice. So I value autonomy and choice. And so the
Right.
ability
Okay.
to choose suffering would be good.
Okay. Whether or not you actually did choose it.
Yeah. I think that part matters. So like, yeah, it's having the option is important in and of itself, even if you don't end up choosing it. But I think that because people have a variety of different needs and desires and experiences,
Hmm.
many people would choose it. That many people would choose to play video games if they could in heaven. I don't see that as given how many people like video games here, it seems very likely
Hmm.
that they would probably like video games in heaven too. And so many people would choose to experience some level of pain and conflict. And so that seems like a fundamental aspect of what people are to some degree. And so I think that, yes,
Hmm.
having the freedom to choose that thing is important, not only even if they don't choose it, but also because lots of people probably would choose it.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, that might be so. And maybe in heaven, I saw people mentioning No Man's Sky in the chat there. Even in heaven, you might finally be able to visit every single planet in it.
Okay, well
Whether
that
that would
just
keep you
proves
entertained.
boredom would just be, oh man, that would just be hella boredom. Oh, hated that game. It was so bad.
Ah, dear, I love No Man's Sky. But that may say something about my view of heaven. All right. Well, part of the question of what heaven would be like, of course, is how much it would be like how similar it would be to, you know, Earth, like everyday life. So like there's have you read Julian Barnes's book, The History of the World in 10.5 chapters? The final chapter, it's really a series of sort of linked short stories, but the final chapter of that, the narrator dreams that he has died and gone to heaven. And heaven turns out to be this sort of a kind of luxury resort that he's staying in. There are people there who look after him in every conceivable way. He can do whatever he wants. So, you know, he spends his time eating fabulous meals and playing golf, and he gets better and better at golf as time goes on, until finally he's hitting a hole-in-one with every single shot that he takes, because it's like the perfect, he's become the perfect golfer. And so he gives that up and takes something else up. And eventually he sort of finds himself getting bored of it all. And he chooses to move on from heaven and basically, you know, cease to exist, as indeed also happens in The Good Place, which I hope isn't too much of a spoiler for people, but they dramatize exactly this issue. You know, would you get bored with heaven eventually? And all of that's all very well, but I think that a religious person would say, if you're thinking of heaven in those sorts of terms, then you're thinking too small. You know, the perfect life for a human being isn't a life where you lounge around in shiftless luxury and do whatever you want. It's not a life where you play even the most challenging video games and overcome strife and suffering and conflict and so on. The genuinely perfect life for human beings is one that's focused on God. And supposedly being focused on God, you know, the beatific vision of God would give you everything that is good about the ordinary things we think about in life, or that we might wish that we had, but to a gazillionth degree, you know, to such an extent that you wouldn't want to play golf or whatever video game you like, or be weighted on hand and foot and so on, because all those things are just kind of shallow reflections of the goodness that is God. Now, I suspect you're probably not going to be very convinced by that. And I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure I'm very convinced by it either, because any description of what that is like is inevitably going to, you know, just say, well, it's God, and, you know, God is fantastic. So as long as you're contemplating God, you know, that's all you need, which isn't very satisfying, really. But I don't know. I think that, well, I don't know. What do you think of that?
It sounds very much like the experience machine. There's just this thing that is just so perfect and gives you such a perfect level of happiness just by like staring at it and doing nothing else but just
But
staring
it would
and
be real,
devotedly.
right? Unlike the experience machine. The experience machine just gives you fake experiences, whereas this is, you know, God, if there is a God, is the ultimate reality. You know, God is being itself. It
Well, I
couldn't
think
be
that's
more
I
real.
would say that the experience machine goes a little bit further than about contrasting reality to fiction, because heroin is real. Technically, the experiences are real experiences, and the fact that they exist in reality. But I think
Hmm.
what matters to the experience machine is that people would value the sense of accomplishment they get more if it was derived from some kind of something they're doing, rather
Hmm.
than given to them by a switch in their brain. So if they just had a
Hmm.
switch in their brain to flip on happiness switch off kind of a thing, most people would probably choose not to do that. They would want to have some kind of a challenge or an accomplishment they go through, or some kind of life goals that they work through something, and by achieving some kind of ends through this progress that they're making, they get happiness from that, rather than just flipping on the on happiness switch. And so in this context, God would essentially be the happiness on switch.
Hmm.
And I think that people would probably not choose that, other than Christians, for the same reason they would probably want to have some kind of an experience like a video game or a life experience or a challenge to overcome to get happiness. And they would probably prefer that rather than just turning on the God happiness on switch. And I think the vast majority of people would probably see that as synonymous with the experience machine.
So what you're saying is very in tune with the trends, with the trends in contemporary theology. I mean, like I say, the fashionable view in theology today, and philosophers of religion who've sort of talked about it is very much like that. The idea that heaven wouldn't be just everything given to you on a plate. It's a place of constant change and striving and challenge and development. So people often in this context, they cite Gregory of Nyssa, the great 4th century theologian who, among other things, was one of the very first people to argue that God is infinite, because people hadn't thought that before the 4th century, even Christians. And Gregory had this idea of heaven as infinite progress. So his idea was that when you go to heaven, you learn about God, you develop morally, you develop your understanding, but there's always more to go. Every time you think you've got to the end of it, it's new vistas open up. You know, it's like climbing a mountain. It looks like you're almost at the top, but you get over that rise, and in fact, it's not. There's more of it. Keeps on going, and it keeps on going and going and going and going forever for Gregory. There's no end to it. It's an eternal progress because God is infinite, and so one can infinitely progress into God, if you like. And that has been picked up on by a number of people today, who think that it gives a version of heaven that's more appealing because it sort of scratches all those itches you just mentioned, the idea that we want there to be challenge and progression and always new things, and we don't want to get bored. But also that it overcomes a lot of the objections to heaven. So one objection to the traditional view of heaven is that it's very intellectualist. You know, Thomas Aquinas thought that heaven is a matter of, as I mentioned, the beatific vision, where we're all just sort of gazing at God and just kind of basking in God's amazingness. And it's a very, like I say, intellectualist view, because it's sort of about understanding God and, perceiving God. And for a lot of people, that is inherently kind of not particularly attractive. And it's not something that, that most people would want. So yeah, you're kind of, perhaps surprisingly, in the theological mainstream of today, whereas I'm more of a throwback. You see, maybe it's a sort of inherent laziness in me, but I quite like the idea of just sort of lazing around looking at God, or assuming that God is worth looking at for all eternity, which remains to be shown. As I say, the idea is that because God is infinite, that makes God infinitely interesting, which I don't think really does follow. I mean, you could spend infinity listing every number, couldn't you? And that wouldn't necessarily be infinitely interesting. You'd get bored doing that quite soon. So the mere fact that, if it is a fact that God is infinite, I don't think guarantees God being infinitely interesting. But God is presumably not merely infinitely big, but kind of infinitely wonderful. But how that gets fleshed out is a bit vague as well. But yeah, I don't like the idea of an infinity of striving and growing and developing and challenging and learning and doing new things like that. But like I say, the way you view heaven is a sort of projection of the kind of things that you value. So ultimately, you can't really argue for one view over another. Whether that be within a theological context or just as a sort of thought experiment like we're doing. You can't really say this way is better than that way, and that's just and here's my argument for it, because ultimately it's going to come down to just what you personally value. And you may think that what you personally value is what most people would personally value, but even if it is, that doesn't really prove anything.
Well, that's why I would go further, and I'd say that having the option to choose what any individual values would be better. So even though you may prefer a sedentary life, and I may prefer a video game life, a heaven or a world that gives us the option to pick each of those would be better than one that does not have the option to pick those. And so taking a more general approach of this consent or choice option thing as being the inherent good does seem to give us a way to assess that this kind of a world would be better than other kinds of worlds. So it seems like the kind of a world where we have free choice to decide anything we want, including pain and suffering and death and whatever, would be better. Like having, you mentioned the guys who just poof out of existence kind of a thing, that should be an option for people. And taking away that option for people, I think, would be immoral. I think that would be wrong to do that. And so I think that having the options themselves, in and of themselves, is a good that people should have, that makes the world a better place. So if we think of heaven as a perfect place, then it must necessarily have this aspect of it, because if it didn't, it would make it a less than perfect place.
I don't know. I mean, that sounds very plausible, but I don't know. I mean, so personally, philosophically, I suppose I'm a hedonist. You know, I think that pleasure is the ultimate good, and that most moral notions ultimately depend on that. So I'm not one of those people who places a huge value on choice and things like that. Obviously, lots of people do, and maybe it's sort of a sign of my own privilege that I can, you know, not attach much importance to it. You know, maybe that's just a sign of the fact that I do have a lot of choice in my life, and if I didn't, I would value it more highly. But I don't know. I don't see personally. I don't see any great value in the ability to choose stuff like that. I don't see any value. You know, if I'm given the ability to choose A or B, and A is definitely better, and it's what I would have gone for anyway, I don't really see that's a better situation than if I were just given A. I just don't see the value of it. And I think that okay, well, put it like this. Within the context of Catholic moral theology, there is a human nature is a sort of given, and it's a kind of universal. We're all human, and that means we're all fundamentally the same. You don't have to be a Catholic to think that, I'm sure. But Catholics would say that because we are all sort of fundamentally the same, there is a fundamental human good that is universal to all of us. You know, what is best for one of us is best for another of us as well. And we might have, you know, we might have preferences about different sort of elements of it that we prefer, but ultimately there is a single state of being that is best for human beings. Whether you would choose it or not, whether you think you would choose it or not, if you had perfect understanding, you would choose it. You know, everyone would choose it. And that being so, then there's nothing incoherent about the idea that heaven is the same for everybody, because it is actually what we would all prefer. You know, the same thing. I mean, I'm kind of. Well, I'm not exactly arguing for devil's advocate. It's the opposite. I'm arguing an angel's advocate. You know, I don't necessarily think this is true, but it just, I don't know. I think. Do you see what I'm trying to get at? Yeah.
Well, I would say that goes very counterintuitive to my experience. So, like when I play a video game, I could instantly turn on God mode and become perfect video game player, essentially, or turn on a chess computer and become perfect chess player or whatever. But I don't. I deliberately do not do that. I have the option of having perfect skills or perfect power.
Right, but the thing is, a video game is an imperfect analogy, right? Because at least with most video games, the whole point is that it's a challenge, and that's where the enjoyment comes from. And so putting on the cheat mode is, removing the point of it. But life isn't like that, is it?
Imagine for some people it is. So I think the purpose, meaning, value in life, I'm a moral realist, so I think those exist. But I think a lot of that is derived from individual yearnings for things, or what they want out of life, what they enjoy out of life. So I think that because the value in life is determined by the individual, and they can have their life value be to overcome challenges, then to remove that would be to remove the purpose of life of particular individuals. So it would be no different than putting someone in slavery, or to remove all the things people get joy from in life and say you can't get joy from that anymore, which seems problematic for the idea of heaven. The atheist thing is like being and worshiping God for all eternity sounds a lot like hell to us. So we're like, I don't know if that sounds all that great. We'd probably prefer sex, drugs, and rock and roll for all eternity. Bring me to hell with all the cool people. And so it's difficult to think that applying this logic that there's some kind of perfectly happy state would be any different from my perspective than the experience machine. You're just forcing me into this highly dopamine induced state that I didn't choose or want, and that eliminates the things I get value from in life and just gives me direct happiness experience. To me, it seems like hell, not heaven.
Yeah, it's interesting how different people have such different values, isn't it? I mean, there's there's a long-standing sort of joke that the kinds of things that heaven is described as involving would be kind of pretty tedious to most normal people. There's that joke in Blackadder, but heaven is for the kind of people who enjoy the sort of things that happen in heaven. Things like singing hymns and talking to God and watering pot plants and so on. The point being that hell would be far more interesting. And in fact, it goes back at least to George Bernard Shaw had a sort of play within a play called Don Juan in Hell, where his characters sort of dream that they're in hell. And it turns out that hell isn't too bad, really. And the only people who are in heaven are the kind of people who kind of feel that they ought to enjoy heaven without actually enjoying it. And Bernard Shaw says it's like the kind of people who go to classical music concerts because they sort of feel that they should enjoy it. And almost all of them are English, he says. Bernard Shaw never misses an opportunity to slag off the English. But although, I mean, yeah, it's true. Obviously, the way heaven is traditionally described as like, floating around on a cloud or talking to God or whatever doesn't sound particularly interesting. But that's not really a serious objection, right? I mean, if there really were a God, and if God really is the sum of all goodness and the most perfect being that there is, and if being in the presence of God is the most enjoyable thing there could be, then it kind of would be, don't you think?
No, I just have this really strong intuition that the choice to do that or to not do that would just inherently make it better. So it's like my argument for the problem of evil. I like the logical problem of evil runs the same thing. It's like the best of all possible worlds. Just take whatever. There could be infinitely many unknown goods that we have in this world, but we can always make it better by adding one extra good, which is make it optional. And so if we make all of these goods optional, you've made it better. And so if I take that idea of heaven and then just add the thing of it's optional, it just seems to be better, just inherently better. Because if people can say, I would like to experience this and then do so, and then choose to not experience that, and then take some time off, take a million years to play StarCraft or Star Wars or go play Lord of the Rings, and then come back to the perfect experience thingy, that just seems much better. Simply because you have the option to go explore things, to limit your experiences like a video game. I don't see the advantage there of being forced into this particular extreme state and then not being given the option to exit that extreme state on particular intervals to try different things. Seems a lot like slavery. It seems bad, seems immoral. And so there's this hard disconnect for me of being forced into this state versus being given the option to be in this state, and then choosing to leave it at particular times. It seems like if you have cake, if someone forces cake down your throat, it's not good anymore. You don't like the cake. The cake is not a fun experience, even though it's maybe very tasty. The fact that it's being forced on you and you don't have the option makes it a negative thing, a bad thing. And I think the same thing would apply to the God experience in this case. If you don't have the option, if it's being forced down your throat, it becomes immoral or evil or bad. And so I think that aspect of being given the choice to, or option to choose this, and the option to choose other things is just inherently more good.
Well, suppose so. There's this great passage in one of Ian M. Banks' books where so Ian M. Banks's books are all set in this sort of amazing sci-fi universe where super intelligent AIs run everything. And there's a passage in one of them, I can't remember which one, it might be Accession, or it might not be, it doesn't matter, where he talks about how these super brilliant, intelligent AIs spend their time when they're not sort of directing civilization, kind of lost in this imaginary realm of kind of mathematical imagining. They spend their time like creating imaginary worlds and sort of inhabiting them and trying things out and exploring them. They're basically exploring possibility space. And I always quite like that description. And I wondered whether one could apply that to heaven. So God, on the traditional conception, is that I haven't read The Wasp Factory. I've only read the sci-fi ones. What was I going to say? Yeah, so God, on the traditional conception, is a perfectly simple being, but one who contains within himself everything that is possible, right? Because God's understanding contains the ideas of everything that is possible. And of course, God's will contains the ideas of everything that is actual, because God chooses which possible things to actualize. So it always struck me, if heaven consists of the vision of God, then God contains within God's self everything possible, not merely everything actual, but everything possible. Maybe within the vision of God, one could explore all the realms of possibility and imagination that you might wish to, more than we are capable. Yeah, even evil, because God understands all possibles, and that includes all evil things as well. So, I mean, I'm just kind of musing about this because, people think of the traditional vision of God as this rather sort of static, singular, basically boring thing that's
divine aseity. It's perfectly unchanging, singular essence of Thomistic philosophy.
But would it be? That's the thing. If there is a God who contains within God's self everything, then saying I might want to turn off the vision of God and look at something else instead might be kind of missing the point, because maybe everything you could possibly want to do or contemplate or whatever is in God. You see what I mean?
Yep, I think like that would make it closer to my vision of heaven, where if you have all the options to choose from, but it seems like it would be counter to the narrative of Christianity that God is perfect and there's nothing wrong with God. And so like saying the idea of playing Dark Souls or something and getting destroyed by a boss is like inherent a part of God or something, or that
but if that's a good thing, why shouldn't it be? I mean, there's nothing immoral about playing Dark Souls, is there?
Well, the way I see it, I guess a better analogy would be is like, would the freedom to choose to live in this world exactly as it is be an option in heaven? I would say probably not, because this world has a lot of evils in it, rape, murder, death, cancer, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's a good to have that option, that some people may choose to live in this world exactly as it is today, which would include evil. And that would have to be a logical possibility that would be in God's nature in this analogy, which would be problematic for me, because that would be evil. There would be evil there. And so I think the world would be better if it had evil as an option. I would agree that that's the case. But God having evil in his nature as an option seems to have theological consequences.
Well, so when I say, I mean, he wouldn't have nature in it, wouldn't have evil in his nature, but he has understanding of it. I mean, you could, I don't know. I mean, like I say, I don't believe in heaven at all, right? I don't think there is a heaven, unfortunately, because, I wish there were, although if there were, I probably wouldn't be going there. So it's a largely academic question for me, really. But
Pascal's wager: equally likely to go to heaven if there's an atheist universe or a God universe, exactly the same probabilities, no difference.
Oh no, what do I do? I need to spin a coin to decide or something. So I don't think there is one, but I'm a kind of medieval throwback in that if there were one, I would quite like the Thomistic one, where it is perfection and serenity and sort of intellectual contemplation. That may be a sign, like I say, that I'm sort of fundamentally lazy, and that's kind of what I would most value. Obviously, you value quite different things. You know, you are much more of a modern theologian, if you are a theologian at all. You seem to agree with the theological trends today that strife and development and overcoming difficulty and learning new things, and they're always being changed, and we're always moral agents who face serious questions and problems and dilemmas and things, like for all eternity. You know, so a view of heaven that makes it a lot more like Earth, really. That's the fashionable one today. But like I say, I just find it kind of exhausting.
Well, yeah, but that's why I think it seems like giving everyone the option for themselves to be able to pick their own universe, I think, is the highest good. I think that is the
Right.
best of all possible worlds. And so giving you
So,
the
so,
option to go to yours and go ahead.
so would you say then that that is coherent? I mean, what you've just described as what you imagine, you know, heaven would be. Everyone can sort of choose their own thing. Would that be a coherent situation?
I believe so. There'd have to be at least one constricting rule to make it coherent, which is that it would be physically impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. But once you have that rule in place, then yes, it would be a coherent possible model.
So, but you couldn't have but it couldn't, I mean, desires will conflict, right? I mean, suppose my idea of heaven is that I spend the whole of eternity with a particular person, and maybe that's pretty much her idea of hell, and she would rather spend the whole of eternity, you know, without me. We can't both have it, can we?
Yeah, that's why the rule that I mentioned, that it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to
Mm,
doing. Your will only applies to yourself and your property or your universe, the universe. So you wouldn't be able to force someone else into your universe. You could design your universe however you want, have as many artificial intelligences as you want, no consciousnesses, and then each individual conscious agent would have the option, if they wanted to join your universe if it was open to that. But you couldn't
mm,
force them to. They'd have their own universe. They could do what they wanted with it. You could make joint universes, but as long as there's this rule in place that every will has autonomy over itself, and you can't force any will to do anything they don't consent to doing, that one rule is in place. As long as you can still do everything you want with your universe, then it would be coherent in that sense. You couldn't force someone else into your universe. They would
mm.
have autonomy. So that'd be the only restriction here to will.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe that's mostly coherent. So in that case, it sounds like you agree with me that the concept of heaven is not an incoherent concept.
Well, I don't, in general, no. I think that heaven's definitely possible, as in you die and you go to a better place. Like, yes, there are better places, many possible better
Mm,
places. And I think there is a potential best place, and that best place could be described as heaven. Though I don't think it would be, I do not think a good candidate for that would be the experience machine or the God version of the experience machine, or just sitting in Thomistic joy of God. But yes, I think that the idea that there is a best of all possible worlds and we can call it heaven is a coherent concept. Yes.
mm. Excellent. Then we sort of agree.
Well, I'm all for heaven. I want there to be a heaven. Be great. I think that is kind of the goal of humanity, is to be able to build technologically heaven from the ground up once we have enough control over physics. So yes, definitely all for heaven.
That is good.
We don't have any questions in the audience. Normally we have questions. 60-second skeptic. He does all my animations. Any other thoughts you have while we wait for questions to come in?
Mm.
Oh, Jay Fay asked me a question about how would I feel if I were wrong and led all my family and friends to hell? Well, I have high functioning autism, so there's that quote that's, I think, I forget what it was, that said, why would God give me a brain and not have me use it or something? And so I'd be following the evidence in one way or the other. I think it was Galileo or something.
Well, quite. And I mean, for all you know, God doesn't like unquestioning faith and rewards people who question stuff and punishes people who believe stuff, That's perfectly possible.
Yep. Nick asks, is there only heaven and hell? God doesn't send you so I can go to the beach?
Well, I suppose there's purgatory as well, and limbo, perhaps.
Ohio.
I mean, when we talk about heaven, it's kind of shorthand to a certain extent, because at least within Christianity, the doctrine is actually a lot more complicated than that. The traditional Christian view is that when you die, your soul separates from your body and it goes off to be with God, and that's sort of heaven. But that is not your final destination. That's just a temporary state. At the end of time, God then raises everyone from the dead, brings back their bodies, their same bodies that they had when they were alive, even though that's kind of problematic, but does anyway. You're put back into your body, and then you have the general judgment, and then everybody goes to either the new heavens and the new earth, where they exist forever in their resurrected state, or they go to the other place. So heaven technically is a temporary state that comes before the final resurrection, and your sort of permanent state after that is the resurrection life. People talk about heaven and hell as if it's just as straightforward as just going there and that's it, but it's way more complicated, which screws everything up really.
Yes, God initiates the zombie apocalypse. They'll come back as little like decomposing bodies and start eating each
indeed.
other.
And yeah, of course, if anyone suffers for eternity in hell, then I refuse heaven. So obviously, a lot of theologians don't believe in hell, or if they do believe in it, they think there's no one there. And there's a whole bunch of pretty good reasons for thinking that. Among other things, it's one would think that as long as there is anyone suffering in hell, you couldn't be happy in heaven knowing that, knowing that God had sent people there. So I think the fashionable view among theologians today is to believe in universal salvation, so everyone goes to heaven or the resurrection life or whatever it is.
I think it's interesting how that our moral interpretations of religion seem to map onto our moral progress of culture, and that like progressive Christianity of being more accepting of LGBTQ things in religion seem to follow the same moral trend as non-religious societies. It's interesting.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Don,
sure
for the super chat. Go ahead.
Sorry, say that again.
Thank you, Don, for the super chat. You sent super chat $10.
Yes.
There are.
Now someone said, does time exist in heaven? Now that's what I'm actually working on at the moment, because that's a really interesting question, because it seems to me that people typically think that it doesn't. Like, so whenever I've talked about heaven to religious people, sort of, and I've mentioned, the boredom problem and things like that, the first thing they always say is, but heaven is outside time. So things like boredom don't apply to it. But the funny thing is, that's a very minority view among theologians. It's almost always been the view that heaven is a temporal state. So time passes in heaven / in the resurrection life, whatever it is. There are some exceptions to that. Augustine thought otherwise. Augustine thought that it's outside time, and he thought that time is something that we're actually saved from. He had this kind of fundamentally Platonic idea that time is kind of bad, and something to be saved from. And I think one of the reasons why people normally think that heaven is temporal is that if heaven is not temporal, then it isn't something that comes after your earthly life. If it's atemporal, then it's neither after nor before nor at the same time as. And that seems really problematic, because you would think that whatever heaven is, it's something that's in the future, at least in your personal future. I'm not really convinced by that. I'm quite attracted to the idea of an atemporal heaven, where there is no time at all. So not that we're all just kind of frozen like statues, not doing anything, but time simply doesn't pass. It's an atemporal state, because well, I think among other things that solves things like the boredom problem and stuff like that, because that only gets off the ground if you do have time, and also because it just seems to me that if you make heaven temporal, then it just feels too much like Earth. It's a kind of anthropomorphizing, really.
I always have a difficulty trying to imagine what that would be like, because say there's like, if there's no time, there's the two ways you mentioned to interpret that. One is like there's a single instance of time where we're just frozen, just a perfect, we're just one that instance, and so there's no progression of time or whatever. Or but if there was zero time, it seems like a conscious state couldn't exist without time of some kind. There'd have to be at least a single like instance of time for the conscious state to exist within. And so if time didn't exist, then I don't know if we could exist in any meaningful way.
But why not? Why do you need time for there to be consciousness?
Well, I think you need some medium that was analogous to time to have consciousness, because you need thoughts, you need progression, intentionality, some kind of ability to transition from one thought to another thought, and any medium that could cause that transition would be analogous to time. And so I don't know. I don't think it'd be possible to have that without a kind of time.
Certainly you would need time or something analogous to time to have discursive thought, where you think of one thing and then you think of the next thing and so on. But I don't see why that should be necessary for consciousness. I mean, a consciousness that didn't do that would be very different from our own, obviously. But you could certainly have intentionality. Intentionality means that your thoughts are of certain things. I don't see that time is necessary for thought to have that feature. For me to think of a thing is for my thoughts to represent it in some way, or for it to be the cause of my thought. But I don't think time is inherently necessary for either of those things, for representation or causality.
Because that one's a tough one. Like, I think causality without time would be difficult, because for one thing to cause a different thing, there would have to be different states in which it was not the case that X happened, then there was a state in which X did happen.
No, not necessarily. I mean, to say that X is the cause of Y, at least on one reading of causality, is simply to say that without X, you wouldn't have Y. So that's a modal concept of causality that has no reference to time. It could be the case that one atemporal thing only exists because another atemporal thing exists. I mean, you could put it in terms of propositions, right? So the number 7, if it exists, is atemporal, right? Well, you might say the proposition 7 plus 7 equals 14. That requires 7 to exist, right? 7 is a more primitive concept than addition. So there you have, if you have a realist view of mathematics and you think that things like numbers are actually existing things, and if you think that mathematical propositions are actually existing things, there you have a case where one atemporal thing depends upon another atemporal thing for its truth.
Yeah, I wouldn't have any problem with that, but my problem would be is how would that apply to consciousness? Because if consciousness, like, I don't imagine the number 7 is imagining anything, doesn't have any thoughts or intentions. To have thoughts or intentions, it would seem like you would need some kind of relations to time-based causality or interactions or change or something. I don't know what it would mean, except in the case of you just have a single instance of thought, time, just frozen in time. But would that really count as consciousness? I don't think so. I think a single instance of what we count as consciousness that is unchanging probably wouldn't be consciousness any more than like taking a slice of my brain would be me.
So this again is intuition, right? And my intuition says otherwise. I mean, maybe when I think I'm imagining an atemporal state, I'm I'm kind of fooling myself, and I'm really thinking about like a brief instant or an extended period of nothing happening or something like that. But it seems to me that I yeah, if there were an atemporal conscious being, its experience would be extremely different from our own. But I don't think that that would be enough to rule out it being conscious. I mean, I hesitate to use it as an example because you'll probably reject it. But at least on the classical view of God, God is like that, right? God is supposed to be classically, and a lot of people disagree with this now, but classically, God is supposed to be atemporal. So God is outside time. God does not experience time in the way that we do at all. God does not experience one thought, then another thought, then another thought. God sort of experiences everything in this kind of eternal instant, or something like that. And like I say, a lot of theologians and other religious people today don't like that idea for a whole bunch of reasons. But I don't think there's anything inherently incoherent about it.
Yeah, I would definitely lean towards the, like, is there a logical contradiction in to say that consciousness can exist without time? I don't know. I can't figure that one out.
I mean, if you're atemporal, what you're conscious of is probably going to be something pretty weird. But you're atemporal. I mean, you could be an atemporal being and have a consciousness of temporal things, right? Because if you're outside the temporal stream, that doesn't restrict your attention to being outside the temporal stream. So an example might be, say I'm reading a novel. I am outside the temporal stream of the narrative, right? I could be say I'm reading Lord of the Rings. I am not walking through the Shire, and I am not lost in the mines of Moria, right? I am outside it as I'm reading it, and I can flick back and forward in the book, of course, and find out what's going to happen next, because I don't fancy reading through 500 pages of it just to if I don't have to. But my attention could be on particular scenes within the story, right? So in a sense, I am atemporal from the point of view of anyone who's inside the narrative. But my attention could be on the whole story or parts of the story or whatever. So just being atemporal doesn't necessarily mean that you have no experience of time. It just means you would experience it in a very different sort of way from someone that's inside time, I think.
Well, my question would be like, can your attention shift from one thing to another thing in this state of timelessness consciousness? And if it can't,
No.
then it seems like you'd be stuck at looking like a single frame of a movie indefinitely. Like that would be you just be unable to change from the single frame. And the single frame would just include everything or whatever if you're in touch with everything. But it would seem like if it's unable to change in any way, would that really count as consciousness? Like the consciousness is what it's like to be a bat or what it's like to be something. Does simply having a single frame of consciousness count as consciousness? And I don't know. If that does. What it's like to be something, the experience is just one frame. Is that really an experience at all?
I don't see why it wouldn't be if it were a really awesome frame. I mean, rather than thinking of a single frame of a film, imagine you've got every single frame from the entire film sort of laid out all in front of you.
Or still be a single frame though.
Yeah, it's still a single frame, but it's a pretty awesome frame.
Yeah, I definitely have to think about that more. I don't have a lot of thought processes going through about how to process that memory, so I'd have to consider that more to figure out what I feel about it, because I do not know. We did finally get some questions though. Facts and Conspiracy asked, do you believe in free will? And is there free will in heaven? If there's free will in heaven, why not just make Earth a heaven from the get-go?
So if I had omnipotent power, the first thing I would do is make nobody able to use the phrase free will. I would just ban it from reality completely. It annoys me tremendously. Not because I have a problem with free will in itself, but because the phrase is almost meaningless. It really is. Everyone who uses the phrase free will means something different by it.
Ah, so you're a compatibilist. Haha.
Yes, I am a compatibilist. Yes, I'm totally a compatibilist. So I think that freedom, or better, responsibility, right? I'd rather use the word responsibility. If I'm responsible for my action, that has got nothing to do with whether or not my action was determined or not. It's entirely got to do with whether I did the action or not. So do people have free will in heaven? Well, depends on your view of heaven, obviously. And it depends on your view of free will. So Augustine, again, famously thought that in heaven, we will lose the ability to do what's wrong. But he thought that is a higher freedom than having the ability to do what's wrong. Which I'm inclined to think is I'm quite attracted to that sort of view. But I'm old-fashioned enough to quite like Augustine. I don't think he'd like me, but I like him. I think that the kind of heaven that I wish existed is the kind of heaven where, like I say, it's outside time, nothing happens, and everything is kind of inert. So the concept of free will or action or responsibility or anything like that doesn't really arise, I don't think. I don't think it's a meaningful question. I think that if, God forbid, it turns out that there is a heaven and it's the kind of fashionable heaven where we're going to spend our time striving and being moral and having problems and overcoming adversity and learning stuff, then I'm sure that whatever your definition of free will may be, there would be free will there, because that's the kind of thing that we think is important in that sort of life. That's the best I can do, I'm afraid.
Gotcha. And Martin asks a similar question: do the laws of logic exist in heaven? Laws of logic, laws of nature.
Well, you'd think the laws of logic would, assuming that the laws of logic are universal, right? I mean, most philosophers would say that 2 + 2 = 4, or something cannot be true and false at the same time in the same way. Those are fundamental logical laws, and so even God has no power over those laws. On the classical view of God, God cannot make it the case that 2 + 2 = 5. He just can't, because that's inherently impossible. And omnipotence means only the ability to do whatever is inherently possible. So yeah, the laws of logic would apply in heaven. Unless, of course, you have a more radical view and you think the laws of logic aren't universal or real after all, or are just arbitrary things that we've made up or something like that, then anything goes, really.
Dialetheism, yes. All right, I think that was it for the questions. We've been going for a little over an hour. Really appreciate you coming on. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Links or references. Well, you can look me up on the University of Exeter website, where you will see a picture of me looking a lot younger than I am now, less jaded, not quite so close to heaven. Well, probably equally far from heaven as I am now. And that's got some links to some of my papers and things like that. Otherwise, you can find some of my books on, because I have written a bunch of books on who's my publisher? Lion Hudson is my publisher in this country. IVP have published some of my things in the US. But some searchers will find you those things.
Awesome. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me, and the same to you.
All right. Talk to you later.